So this Committee for Economic Development was a very influential organization, and within its first 15 years of being organized, 38 of its members were elected to public office. 2 of its members were the presidents of the Federal Reserve Board. And I don't mean to suggest that this is some kind of wild conspiracy. It's just a group of individuals who have the same economic interest and a lot of resources and the smarts to get together and start strategizing about how to change the policies that they thought would be beneficial for their businesses and economic interests. And one of their fundamental beliefs was that there were too many farmers. Hey, come on in. Okay. So they believed there were too many farmers and that something had to be done to really encourage young men not to go into farming. They believed that capital would replace labor in modern farming, that companies should be vertically integrated, and I think we all know what vertical integration is. An example today is Tyson, the giant meat company, with their poultry production. They own the genetics of the chick, they own the chicks, they own the feed. They basically control the contract growers that make about $12,000 to $15,000 a year. They own the slaughter facilities where the chickens are slaughtered after 45 days. They own the slaughterhouses where the chickens are slaughtered and then dipped in chlorine and sodium phosphate to kill the bacteria because the slaughter lines move so quickly. And they own the brand in the grocery store. And that's kind of the ultimate vertical integration that these men back in the 1940s and 50s were thinking about. Now, I'm not really sure that they fully realized what they were actually promoting. But these individuals were very successful in attracting most of the titans of industry to the Committee for Economic Development. And they also attracted the leadership of most of the institutions that are important in society, the most prestigious universities, the publishing industry, the newspaper industry, most of the industries that really play a role in then figuring out public policy and influencing public policy. And so in the 1950s, they began to have an effect on food and farming policy under the Eisenhower administration. There was a Secretary of Agriculture whose name was Ezra Benson, and he was someone who was very much of an ideologue. And you'll remember that in the 1950s, this was the McCarthy era, and there were people who were seeing communists behind every tree. And this fit in very well with Ezra Benson's belief system because he thought that the Roosevelt policies on agriculture were leading the country towards communism. And he was dead set against any of these programs that actually made it viable to continue farming. And so he began in his capacity as Secretary of Agriculture to chip away at the ability of farmers to make an income on par with urban workers. And things began to galvanize for the Committee for Economic Development. And by the 1960s, they had become very, very powerful. And especially powerful because they had the newspaper and publishing industry involved with their organization, and also the major economics departments of prestigious universities. So in collaboration with several of the economics departments of universities like Harvard and Yale, they put together a plan called an Adaptive Plan for Agriculture. And the crux of it was that there are too many farmers. We don't need all of these small farms. It's not efficient to have small farms. We need much larger farms. We need to really have a a food system that's based on efficiency. It's more efficient to produce food overseas, grow grains in the United States. And we need to change the education of young men who are going into agriculture and convince them that they should go, especially to the industrial north, to be cheap labor for industry. And they dressed this up some, but that was basically the idea from this very influential report. Now, you can imagine that a lot of the farm organizations thought that this report was a disgrace. And at this period, there was still a lot of political power in the hands of some of these progressive farm organizations, like the Farmers Union, the Grange, the Farm Organization. These were organizations that really, if you know your farm history, had been on the vanguard of progressive politics from after the time of the Civil War, when they fought the banks and the railroads over their regressive policies that made it very difficult for farmers to get loans or to get their products to market. They joined with other progressive forces and worked with labor, and through the decades they were often at the state level very involved in getting candidates elected, and there was a real political power in the hands of farm organizations, which of course has dwindled dramatically since we have so many fewer farmers today. But at this period in the 1960s, when this plan for changing agriculture came out, the farm organizations had some interesting tactics. And at this period, the Committee for Economic Development's two co-chairs were the president of Ford and the president of Sears and Roebuck. And so these farm activists got in their Ford pickup trucks, and I'm sure they're Chevrolets and other vehicles, and they would take their Sears and Roebuck catalogs and they would circle the State House or the local county courthouse in a catalog march, they were called, and then they would get out and they would burn their Sears catalogs in front of these institutions. And they were able to hold off some of the worst policies, but over time, of course, their power has been greatly diminished. So going into the 1970s, in our short little history lesson of how we ended up with this dysfunctional food system, you'll remember that the Nixon administration was in office. And in 1972, the Secretary of Agriculture was Earl Butz. Now, I always kind of smile when I hear Earl Butz's name, because even I, who was a teenager during this period, remember Earl Butz, and he was the butt of a lot of jokes. And you know, today you could walk down the sidewalk and ask most people, unless you're involved in farm policy, nobody would have a clue that Secretary Vilsack from Iowa is Secretary of Agriculture. But I think that most people who watched TV news in the 1960s knew that, or rather the 1970s, knew that Earl Butz was the Secretary of Agriculture, because he was very egotistical. He was always pontificating, and he got a lot of publicity. And he told farmers that they need to get big or get out. They need to borrow a lot of money, and they need to plant fence row to fence row, and that the U.S. Was going to be a grain powerhouse, and that any farmer who wanted to be successful needed to get big, and if you weren't willing to get big, you needed to just get out. And he made it possible for some farmers to get out, and his policies forced out some farmers, because he cut parity, or the ability of farmers to make the cost of production, the price supports, by about 50%. And he also brokered the grain deal in 1972, when Richard Nixon was running for office against George McGovern. He wanted to make sure that farmers voted for Richard Nixon, and so he worked with the grain traders, Cargill and others, to make it possible to do what was basically an illegal deal, selling grains to the Soviet Union. And in fact, that was the only year in the 1970s that there was an export market. So the advice that Earl Butz gave to farmers actually devastated farms in the US, and through the end of the 1970s into the 1980s caused a major rural bloodletting. Because what happens when there's no market and you've borrowed a lot of money and you've put in a lot of grains and the price plummets and there's no place to sell them? It means that pretty soon you can't pay off the mortgage, and we lost literally hundreds of thousands of farms during this period.